All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're gonna dive into the world of Sophie de Grouchy. She's a French philosopher from the Enlightenment, and her book Letters on Sympathy really digs deep into how we think about morality, politics, and even the law. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Sophie de Grouchy, for a long time, she's been kind of a hidden figure in philosophy, But lately, there's this like renewed interest in her work, and it's pretty clear why. Her ideas, they're just so relevant today, especially when we think about things like feminist republicanism, what was going on intellectually back in the 18th century, and how she was engaging with other big thinkers like Adam Smith. And she really gets into these like fundamental questions about society and justice, and it's really powerful stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, for this deep dive, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on her. It's super detailed. And our goal today, it's to really pull out the most interesting parts of her life, her ideas, and really get a sense of how all of that, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, how all of that shaped her as a philosopher. So, okay, let's start with the basics. Sophie de Grouchy, she was born Marie-Louise Sophie de Grouchy back in 1764. What jumps out at you about her early life, her family, all of that?
Well, she came from a pretty uh, privileged background, which definitely gave her some advantages when it came to education, things that most women just didn't have access to back then.
Yeah.
She married Nicolas de Condorcet. You've probably heard of him, a really important mathematician and philosopher. And her family, there's some interesting connections there. Like her sister Charlotte, she married Pierre-Georges Cabanis, who became a close friend of Sophie's. They really like bounced ideas off of each other. And then there's this almost unbelievable story about her brother, Emmanuel de Grouchy. He was a marshal under Napoleon. And legend has it that he was so busy enjoying strawberries at a key moment during the Battle of Waterloo that it like contributed to the French defeat. It's wild.
Strawberries, huh? Talk about changing the course of history. But yeah, it's a good reminder that while all these huge historical events are unfolding, there are these like personal stories happening too, right?
Yeah.
But back to Sophie, can you tell us a little bit about her education, how she became, such a curious intellectual person?
Yeah. So she was educated at home. Early on, she had the same tutors as her brothers, and her mother was like really into creating this intellectual atmosphere. And then later, she went to a convent finishing school. But, she was always like, going above and beyond what they were teaching. She was reading all the big Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau, Voltaire, all of them. And she was a real whiz with languages. I mean, she became fluent in English and Italian, translating like Edward Young, Torquato Tasso. And this is pretty striking. She became an atheist at a young age, which, tells you a lot about her independent thinking.
Yeah, definitely not your typical young woman of that time. And then after she marries Condorcet, their home in Paris, it becomes this really important salon. Can you talk about that a bit? What made it so special?
So their salon, it was like this hub. It drew in all these different thinkers, writers, political figures, French, international, all kinds of people. And they would just like hash out ideas. It was a really important place for those early revolutionary ideas to kind of take shape and grow. Just imagine all these intense discussions happening right there in their living room.
I can almost picture it. And Sophie, she wasn't just, serving refreshments and making sure everyone was comfortable. She was a real participant, right? Yeah. In the discussions and the whole political scene.
Oh, yeah, for sure. She was definitely not just sitting on the sidelines. In 1791, she, Condorcet, Thomas Paine, and a few others, they started this Republican journal called Le Républicain. It only lasted a short time, but it was a really strong voice for Republican ideals in France. And so she contributed articles, sometimes anonymously, sometimes under the name La Vérité, that means truth, which, was even her personal motto. She did some translating for the journal, too, including some of Paine's writings. And this is interesting. It's pretty likely that around this time, she was already working on the early ideas for her Letters on Sympathy, which was her like response to Adam Smith's ideas.
Wow, so she's got this salon going on. She's involved in radical politics, and she's developing her own philosophical arguments. It's amazing. But then, of course, the French Revolution takes a dark turn with the Reign of Terror. What happened to her and Condorcet during that time?
Yeah, it was a tough time. Condorcet, he was proscribed in 1793, which meant he basically had to go into hiding or be arrested. He managed to stay hidden until the spring of 1794, but he died while he was trying to escape. And during all that, Sophie was just incredible. She was a rock for him, intellectually and emotionally. There's even evidence that she helped him with his last and very influential work, The Sketch of Human Progress. She'd visit him in secret, and later she took on the huge task of editing the manuscript, which was unfinished. And after Condorcet's death, They confiscated all her property, but Sophie was so resilient, she started painting miniature portraits to support herself. Can you imagine? And once the terror was over, she decided to publish her letters on sympathy, and she did it alongside her own translation of Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Her translation is actually considered to be much better than the ones that came before it, and from then until her death in 1822, she basically dedicated herself to keeping her husband's legacy alive, editing his collected works, and she was still involved in the philosophical world through her salon and letters with Cabanis.
It's a pretty amazing story of intellectual dedication in the face of all that personal tragedy and political chaos.
It really is. It's inspiring. So let's talk more about the intellectual influences on her thinking. You know, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution. How did all those radical ideas shape her philosophy?
Well, Grouchy was, through and through a product of the Enlightenment. She really embraced all of it, the focus on reason, progress, social justice. You see this in how she was drawn to thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau and, how she rejected traditional religion. Her salon, it was like this bridge to Enlightenment thought from all over the world. It's where she met people like Thomas Paine. And through her connections with the Girondins and, of course, Condorcet, she was kind of indirectly linked to the abolitionist movement, which was another big part of Enlightenment thought.
And these salonières, these women who were hosting these gatherings, it sounds like they were doing a lot more than just like planning parties.
Oh, yeah, way more. I mean, history often remembers them as like these charming hostesses. But women like Sophie de Grouchy, they were so important in shaping intellectual and political debate, and it's often overlooked.
Yeah.
But think about it. In a society that basically told women they couldn't participate in politics directly, their homes became these vital spaces for discussing and developing radical ideas. It was much more acceptable, for women to be involved in these potentially controversial conversations in their own homes, in these more private settings, than in, those very public, male-dominated spaces. And it's worth mentioning that the Girondin faction during the Revolution, they were generally more open to women's intellectual contributions. So that created a bit more space. So yeah, these salons were really important places for women to exercise their intellectual agency.
That's really fascinating how these informal spaces become so politically and intellectually powerful. Okay, so we've talked about her letters on sympathy. What other things did she write or contribute to?
Right. So the Letters on Sympathy, which she published along with her translation of Smith, that's the only full book that came out under her own name while she was alive. But her work with Le Républicain, that's super important for understanding how she was directly engaging in the political debates of the time. Scholars have figured out that she probably wrote a bunch of the articles. One of them, signed La Vérité, was a really strong defense of the French Revolution aimed at an international audience. And it lays out this very clear Republican critique of monarchy in general. There's another piece called Letter from a Young Mechanic, and it's like this brilliant satire. She suggests replacing the whole royal family with, get this, mechanical robots. It's hilarious, and it really highlights how people saw the monarchy as this like financial burden and just, kind of absurd. She also translated some of Paine's work for the Journal, making his radical ideas more available in France. And then, of course, there's her work editing Condorcet's Sketch of Human Progress. It's becoming more and more recognized how important that was.
There's good evidence that she added sections that focus on women and families and how they're key to human progress. Sadly, those parts were later taken out by other editors. And even Condorcet himself, he mentioned in a letter to their daughter that Sophie had written other things on moral philosophy that never got published. So she was clearly working on a lot.
Mechanical royalty, I love it. It's such a clever way to make a political point. And her work on Condorcet's sketch, it really shows this like early feminist perspective, highlighting the family as crucial to how society advances. Okay, let's dive into the specifics of her philosophy now, starting with her moral psychology, which we see in her letters on sympathy.
Okay, so the Letters on Sympathy, it was basically a direct response to Adam Smith's super famous theory of moral sentiments. Grouchy clearly respected Smith, but her main disagreement with him was about how he explained, or didn't really explain, the origins of sympathy. She thought he did an amazing job of describing how sympathy works, how it affects our moral judgments, but he didn't really get into why we're capable of feeling sympathy at all.
So what was Grouchy's explanation then? Where did she think sympathy comes from?
Well, she had this fascinating idea. She thought sympathy had a physiological basis, and that it comes from our earliest experiences as babies. She really emphasized that skin-to-skin contact that infants have with their caregiver, usually a nurse back then, and those basic experiences of pleasure and pain. And she was careful to say that this initial, physical foundation is different from how we develop moral obligations and reasoning later on.
And it's interesting to compare her to other thinkers of that time, like Manna Rowland and Mary Wollstonecraft. They were really focused on maternal feeding as a big part of moral development. Grouchy's argument, it was more about this like universal physical trigger for the sensations that eventually become sympathetic feelings. Her account is very naturalistic. She traces how we develop the ability to connect with others and how morality begins all the way back to these very basic physical experiences. Her key point is that morality isn't just something we learn, it's rooted in our earliest experiences as physical beings.
So she's saying that our ability to care about others, it comes from these very primal shared experiences of comfort and distress that we all have as babies. But how does sympathy grow beyond those initial sensations, according to her? How do we go from feeling what a baby feels to having empathy for all kinds of people and situations?
Well, Grouchy thought that sympathy develops and expands through reason. As we get older and our cognitive abilities grow, we learn to extend those sympathetic feelings beyond ourselves and those closest to us, to a wider and wider circle of people. And she also made distinctions between different types of sympathy, recognizing that it's not just this one simple thing. Ultimately, for Grouchy, morality grows out of this basic human capacity for sympathy, and on that point, she agrees with Smith. And her understanding of this whole process of moral and cognitive development was heavily influenced by thinkers like Locke and Condillac, who also believed that sensory experience is fundamental to how we understand the world. And we can't forget her brother-in-law, Cabanis. His work on the connection between physiology and morality, especially how sensations of pleasure and pain are tied to developing sympathy, that had a huge influence on Grouchy. So she's basically giving us this naturalistic account of how our innate ability to feel with others leads to our moral understanding of the world.
It's a very embodied developmental perspective on morality. And I know the Stanford Encyclopedia entry mentions there are also some stoic and utilitarian elements in her work. How do those fit in with her views on sympathy and morality?
Yeah, that's a really good point. The way she describes the development of sympathy, how it starts with this basic sense of self-preservation, and then gradually expands to include concern for family, then community, and eventually all of humanity. That really echoes the Stoic concept of oikeiosis, which is basically the idea that our social concern grows outward in these expanding circles. The Stoics, they often use what they call cradle arguments, looking at how babies behave to understand basic human nature. And Grouchy's focus on those early experiences fits in with that approach. And then, the fact that she puts so much emphasis on pleasure and pain as the driving forces behind sympathy, and how she suggests that we can judge actions as morally good or bad based on how they benefit humanity overall, that definitely points to some utilitarian thinking. She even says that laws can be evaluated by how well they promote pleasure and minimize pain in society. It's interesting that Cabanis, who had this really interesting back and forth with her in the letters, he was also interested in Stoicism. But his focus was really on the importance of recognizing and alleviating pain, which is something Grouchy definitely shared.
It sounds like she was bringing together all these different philosophical traditions in a really interesting way. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about her political philosophy,
Yeah.
especially in the context of, you know, all that radical Republican thought that was swirling around during the French Revolution.
All right, so Grouchy's political philosophy, it's really grounded in those core Republican ideals of the French Revolution, particularly the idea that liberty means freedom from domination. Her involvement with Le Républicain, that shows how committed she was to promoting republicanism and critiquing monarchy. And it's important to remember that not everyone who was pro-republic during this time agreed on why they were pro-republic. Some people, like those who followed Montesquieu, they thought the specific form of government wasn't as important as whether the ruler, king, or elected official was acting for the good of the people. But Grouchy and the others who were involved with Le Républicain, they argued that hereditary power, which is like the whole point of monarchy, it's inherently arbitrary. So it's always a threat to individual liberty, no matter how good the intentions of the monarch might be.
What about equality? That was another huge and very debated principle of the revolution. What were her thoughts on that?
So Grouchy was most concerned with equality of civic status, meaning everyone should be treated the same way under the law. She wasn't necessarily pushing for everyone to have the exact same amount of wealth, but she did see how dangerous extreme economic inequality could be. Her main point was that when the gap between the rich and the poor gets too big, it's not just unfair, it actually makes it harder for people to see each other as equals, as fully human. And that, in turn, makes it harder to apply moral and legal principles consistently. Her ideas for reducing this inequality, they involve things like recognizing the role of luck, individual talent, and making sure that resources are distributed more fairly from the start. And even though her work doesn't lay out a full-blown feminist theory like Mary Wollstonecraft's does, when she talks about education and sympathy, she's implicitly including women in those arguments. And that reflects her husband Condorcet's views on women's rights, which were very progressive for the time.
So she saw a really strong connection between social and economic conditions and our ability to be a moral and just society. That's interesting. Let's wrap up by talking about her legal philosophy. What were some of her key ideas there?
Okay, so Grouchy's legal philosophy, much like her political views, it all comes back to equality and liberty. She really agreed with Saez, who argued that legal inequality is always dangerous. It leads to some people dominating others, and it creates resentment in society. She was a big critic of how the aristocracy and the clergy had all these special privileges under the ancient regime, where the law was applied differently depending on your social status. She saw that as creating this widespread feeling of oppression and injustice. Her views on punishment were pretty influenced by Cesare Beccaria, a really important Enlightenment thinker on legal reform. She believed in having equal punishments for the same crimes, no matter who committed them. She also believed that justice should be transparent and understandable to everyone. She called this perceptible justice. And she thought punishment should be about trying to awaken the conscience of the offender and help them rehabilitate, not just about inflicting cruel and unusual punishment. This was a big departure from those brutal and often random executions that were common before the Revolution. She was also all for progressive reforms to family law, things like the right to divorce, the option to renew marriage contracts, and more legal rights for children born outside of marriage and for their mothers. These ideas aligned her with people like Olympe de Gouges, and she drew some inspiration from Montesquieu's analysis of Roman law. And another thing, she was a supporter of what we might call commercial republicanism. She thought that having a less regulated market would help reduce poverty and create more economic opportunity, which was a view shared by her husband Condorcet and the economist Turgot.
So, throughout her moral, political, and legal philosophy, there's this consistent theme of fighting for equality, fairness, and a society that's really rooted in our shared capacity for sympathy. It's pretty amazing.
Exactly. Sophie de Grouchy's work gives us this really unique and insightful way to understand what was going on intellectually during her time. Her ideas about the physiological roots of sympathy, her involvement in the crazy world of the French Revolution, and her thoughtful engagement with someone like Adam Smith, all of this makes her such a significant and original voice in 18th century thought. Learning about her and understanding her contributions is not just important for getting a more complete picture of social and political philosophy, but also for recognizing the crucial intellectual work that women were doing during a time when their voices were often silenced or ignored.
This deep dive into Sophie de Grouchy has been really illuminating. It shows how rich and complex the Enlightenment was, especially when we take the time to explore those voices that have been kind of pushed to the side by history. And it leaves us with a question for you, our listeners. Grouchy was really focused on how our physical experiences shape our ability to feel sympathy, and how social and economic inequality can really damage our ability to connect with each other. So, how do those ideas speak to us today? How can we apply them to the challenges we face in our own world? Hopefully, this exploration has inspired you to check out her letters on sympathy for yourself and to learn more about the incredible contributions of women philosophers during the Enlightenment.